I'm Jennifer, the Inquiring Quilter, and welcome to this episode of Intelligent Quilting, where you learn the tips and the traps of various quilting methods so you can choose the ones that work the best for you. Today's topic, one seam flying geese. Really fast method, makes one geese at a time, but because it's so fast, that's not really a problem. And there's no marking. Yay! However, there is one caveat that I want to make you aware of at the top before you start. It is a folded geese unit. The rectangle ends up being folded to form the goose. So when you sew this into a block, you're going to have this little pocket here. And the pocket may get snagged when the quilt is quilted. So if you're going to have a long armor quilter quilt, make sure you show them this and find out that they will quilt it for you. Otherwise, you're going to have to sew along the edges of the goose in each of your blocks prior to turning it over to a long armor. Of course, if you're quilting your own quilt, you know about the pockets and you know to be careful, and you can deal with that as you're quilting with it. So that shouldn't really deter you from using this method. The math involved. You're going to need 1 goose square and 2 sky squares. Again, with a flying geese unit, the triangle is the goose and this is the sky. If I wanted to make 2 by 4 inch finished flying geese, I would need a rectangle that's 2.5 by 4.5. I'm adding a 1/2 inch to each dimension, and I'd need 2 sky squares that are 2.5 inches. So the height of my finished flying geese unit plus a 1/2 inch. So the math is pretty simple. However, if you don't want to be bothered with the math, I need to tell you that in the description of this video, there'll be a link to a free download in which I give you the cutting measurements for all the different kinds of methods for flying geese, which is pretty handy, so you don't have to do the math yourself. So let me show you what we need to do, but let me talk about the tools first that I recommend for this method. Because there's no marking, there's not a lot of tools that you need. You will need to trim this up afterwards, and so a nice ruler, rotating cutting mat is always handy, rotary cutter. The units will come out more or less to size, but it does help to at least measure them to make sure that they're the right size. So that's why you need a ruler. And then the only other thing I recommend is a wool pressing mat, or some other way to press this sucker flat, because you are going to be folding this triangle and you'll want to get that as flat as possible. And I find that a wool pressing mat really helps with that. So now that we know what tools we need and we know what size to cut our squares, we're ready to go. So with this method, you take your goose rectangle and you fold it in half. And you can just finger press that. Actually, let me get onto this is a harder surface. Let me do that. Then I'm going to take 1 sky square and line it up with the bottom. Notice that the fold is here. And I'm going to flip that over so you can see that the fold is there. And then I'm going to take the other sky square and I'm going to put it on top, and then I'm going to pin. Again, notice that your fold is here, and that these overlap. They're out about 1/4 inch, which is good. Then you're going to be sewing along here. So let me pin. You can pin twice if you want to. Don't always pin, frankly, but I think in this case, since you're trying to hold that fabric in, it's nice to have it pinned. So let's take this to the sewing machine now that we have it pinned and we're ready to go. So we're at the sewing machine, and just to review, this is what it looks inside. The fold is here, the overlap is here, and you're sewing along here, 1/4 inch. You could mark your sewing line if you really struggle with your 1/4 of an inch. That would be the only reason you'd have to mark. I'm going to use my pretty tulip pink scissors here. Cut up. By the way, I like to sew onto a scrap of fabric and off to a scrap of fabric. It helps when you're sewing your seam. It will give the sewing machine just a few seconds to get its thread tension all worked out so that you don't get little thread nests at the beginning of your seam. So I like to do that. Now that we've got our things sewn, it's ready for the magic. So come over to the pressing area. So here we've got our unit and we've sewn. So it's time for the magic, and all you got to do is fold. So you take this and you take your goose and you're going to spread it open to form the triangle. And I like to play with this for just a second, make sure it's good. And then once I have it folded out properly, I'll take my iron and press on one side of the triangle, and then come over here and press the other side of the triangle, and then press the whole thing. Pressing is really important here. You want to press this as flat as possible. I like to use a hot, dry iron and my wool pressing mat. Once I get it pressed on the front, I press it on the back. You can press your seams to the side or you can press them open. I typically like to press mine open. There's a lot of fabric in that seam, so there will be a little bit of bulk, but that's okay. And look, absolutely perfect in like, what, 2.5 seconds? We'll go now to the cutting table just to make sure that this is the proper size and to do any trimming if needed, but mostly it's just to verify. This method is a whizzer for fast flying geese, but it's one at a time. So it's called, again, the one seam method, because you're only sewing one seam. See you at the cutting table. Hi, thanks for joining me back here at the cutting table. Let me show you what we do as a final step. I've got my folded flying geese here, and I've pressed it really well using my wool pressing mat. Notice how there is a 1/4 inch right above that tip. Man, you're not going to be... As long as you sew a 1/4 inch, you're not going to be cutting off your tip with this method. So I like to make sure that it's going to be exactly 2.5 by 4.5 inches at this point. So I take my 2 1/4 inch mark and put it right at the point of that flying geese unit. I put my 2.5 inch mark here. Again, remember, I'm trimming this to 2.5 by 4.5 because I'm going to end up with 2 by 4 flying geese. So I'll trim this side, use my rotating cutting mat to trim the top, and there wasn't really anything to trim there. Now I will turn it around. This was the side that I cut, so I will put exactly on 4.5 inches there and 2.5 here, and I'll trim the remaining sides. Looks like there really isn't anything to trim, but maybe a little bit on that bottom there. And since it's folded, that's not surprising that there might be just a little bit of overlap. So there, just a couple of trim points, and we have a perfect flying geese unit. Again, there is a little bit of bulk in the seam and there is the fold, so beware of that. But otherwise, pretty fast and pretty dang perfect. Thank you for joining me on this journey today, and I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. If you did, please like it. That helps other people find it out there on the vast internet. And if you like my teaching style and you'd like to see more tutorials by me, be sure to follow me here on YouTube and you'll be notified the next time I put a tutorial up. Thank you again, and see you around.